Okay, then we are live with episode 41 of Space Rocks Uplink. Just about to bring Mark aboard, and well, there he is. Mark, how are you doing?
I'm good, Alex. Yeah, disappeared momentarily there, so you did some magic trick, but here I am.
Get up conjured from the ether, and well, I'm going to have to talk to you about that background because, of course, it looks like a still from one of my favorite and arguably the best films of all time. But
It might be. It might be.
it,
Yes.
well, it's an auspicious occasion, and it's interesting, Mark, because with all the talk of Mars in the news in the last few weeks, we've chosen to talk about the moon. It's a pretty interesting juxtaposition. So why are we doing that?
Well, as we've been sort of stuck in low Earth orbit now for quite a few years, doing some fantastic science and construction and practice and getting things in low Earth orbit with the International Space Station, we look back and we think, where were we at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s? We were at the moon. So in going forward from low Earth orbit, what's the right way, for example, to get to Mars? Is it to go direct to Mars, which is an awful lot further away than the moon is? The moon is 3 days away, roughly, and then Mars is 6 months away. Should we learn lessons by going back to the moon first? And that might be in lunar orbit. And there are all sorts of reasons we'll talk about this evening why that's different to being in orbit around the Earth. And potentially back on the lunar surface as well. And what can we do there? Is it just a staging post for going to Mars, or is there exciting, interesting stuff to be done on the moon that we just didn't do at the end of the 60s with the Apollo missions? And I think the guest this evening will give us some very interesting insights into why we think the moon is still a very exciting place to go scientifically.
Indeed, a very exciting place scientifically, and two very exciting scientists joining us, I suppose, to talk to us about what it's all about. So tell us a little bit about Hannah and Aidan.
Yeah, so Hannah Sargeant is one of the two guests this evening, and she's just finished her Ph.D. actually at the Open University in the United Kingdom, and she's been working on some very interesting experiments which are designed to test hardware and processing techniques which will then be taken to the moon to extract water from the surface of the moon. People think the moon is a very dry place. We know there is water in ice form, probably hidden at the poles in deeply shadowed regions, so there's no sunshine reaching it. But can you actually get water out of normal lunar the lunar surface, or can you get bits of water and make water? So I'm not going to steal Hannah's thunder on that, but she's done some really interesting experiments which will go to the moon in the next few years. Our other guest this evening is Aidan Cowley, and Aidan works for the European Space Agency. He's a science advisor at the European Astronaut Centre in Cologne, where all of our astronauts go through all their training. And not only do they go through training to go to the ISS, but they're working on what we do next, going to the moon. And Aidan he'll talk about some of the facilities that we've been building up there, some experiments we're doing on long duration spaceflight, both for the human part, but also the robotic part. We shouldn't let the moment go by also without mentioning that actually we did plan to have James Carpenter on this evening, and James works here at ESTEC in the Netherlands where I work, and James is the coordinator for human robotic exploration science. Unfortunately, he put his back out, and he would either be doing it in microgravity. If we could send him to the space station, he'd probably feel fine up there, but the launch, getting him up there, probably wouldn't be good for his back. So James will join us in the future, absolutely, and we're looking forward to that.
Indeed,
but Aidan very kindly agreed to step into the breach.
Indeed, yeah, two tremendous voices, and of course, yeah, we would love to have James back anytime. So without further ado, we're gonna. We never say anything like, we're going to bring him through the airlock, do we? We're, all different. I think,
well, with some of the guests, we should throw them out the airlock. No, it's never quite been like that. But
Indeed, we'll need a sound effect and Here we go. Very good. I think we've got Hannah. Hello. How are you doing? Are you receiving?
I am. Hi, everybody. Hi,
hello. How are you?
Hi, Hannah. Hi.
Hello. Are you receiving? Are you picking us up?
Yes, I can hear you. Good evening, everyone.
Hi, Aidan. Good to see you.
Well, wonderful to have you both aboard, and of course, so many stimulating thoughts just raised by Mark then as he was just introducing the reasons for going back to the moon. Now, Hannah, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you a big framing question. Why are we going back to the moon?
It's what we do. We're explorers. We're always looking for the next unknown, the next destination. I think it's just something that we can't fight. And then also just from a scientific perspective, just trying to find our place in the solar system and beyond. So there's a lot that we can learn scientifically from there, as well as kind of being explorers and moving forward with our space exploration program.
Very
You're up, Aidan.
Same question, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So everything Hannah said, plus I'd also add in, I think going back to the moon is a really fascinating place, not just for the science and the exploration aspect, but also as a place where we can perfect and enhance our technology for exploration beyond the moon. So we can kind of use the lunar environment and the lunar locale as a kind of testing ground for the technology and the operational concepts we'll need for when we go further into the solar system, like to Mars or even further.
So let me pick up on that and immediately, right? Because as you know, anybody who's around the space game knows that it changes over time. It's been direct to Mars, it's been going to asteroids, it's now going to the moon. So what are the real advantages of going to the moon, which really sit in between what we've done in low Earth orbit for decades now on the space station and going to Mars and the greater distance? What can we actually learn at the moon?
So I think one of the big things we can look at in terms of what we can learn at the moon is the concept of sustainability, how we can actually improve our capability to survive and execute these missions further and further away from Earth. And one of the big topics that we're interested in, for example, is the concept of space resources or in-situ resource utilization. You just can't really do this in low Earth orbit because there's not that many resources local to you. Whereas on the surface of the moon, you have a lot of resources there that could potentially be used. And this is a very different way of approaching exploration. And it's a really important thing that we need to master. We need to get our teeth into this problem to understand how we can do this and how we can use these resources to sustain ourselves. Because as you go further into the solar system, it's more and more difficult to depend upon Earth to logistically support you.
So before we go down to the surface, though, we're also building with ESA and with NASA and with the international partners the Gateway, which sits in lunar orbit. So just for a moment, let's pretend, worst case scenario, we actually don't go back to the surface of the moon, but we just go to the Gateway. There've got to be things that we've got to do there scientifically as well. And I'm thinking about radiation belts. I'm thinking about difference in terms of comms being and not being able to get back immediately and so on. So talk us through a few of those things, because Hannah's focus in some sense is on the surface, but let's at least talk about the big elliptical orbit that the Gateway is going to be in.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Mark, the challenge of operating in an environment that's away from low Earth orbit already presents new risks. The big one you mentioned there is radiation. So you're no longer protected by the magnetosphere of Earth. You're in a very different radiation environment when you're orbiting the moon than you would be orbiting the Earth. And that in itself presents a lot of interesting operational challenges we have to be able to face. So, for example, how do we deal with that radiation environment? Should we have more shielding on our vehicles? How do we deal with solar events, for example? These are all new operational things that we have to take into consideration. You also mentioned things like delay propagation for communication, like how long does it take for a signal to get there and back? Yeah, maybe it's only a couple of seconds even at the moon, but as you know, if you're trying to do something like robotic operations, a couple of seconds is really critical. Someone said to me a good way to explain this is try to tie your shoelaces with a 7-second delay on a camera. It's not easy to do, and it only gets worse and worse and worse the further you go out.
Well, this is really interesting though, because of course, Mark is, fan after my heart, has chosen a very interesting Zoom background to put things, in a way, so it's interesting because I think, from a historical perspective or from the observer's perspective, such as my own, the immediate questions are really just the most basic ones. Why has it taken us so long to go back? Why do you think that is? And for how long has it been in our sights in this way? Because of course, a lot of people, and a few of them who are joining us from all around the world are saying a really interesting things. For instance, like why the sudden interest and all that. And I think one of the things that can really happen when things appear in the headlines is your sensation is like, this has all suddenly happened. I mean, so for how long have we been planning to go back or arguing the case for a return to the moon?
It's a difficult question to give a straight answer to because there's obviously a lot of politics involved in it. But I mean, I started working in the space domains in 2013, 2014, and almost immediately I was shown the kind of interagency thinking. We have this kind of working group that crosses the agencies that explains where we think things will go. And even in those roadmaps, it was quite clear that the moon was going to play an important part for exploration, even if we were going to somewhere like Mars. So for me, it wasn't a big shock to see that this is the kind of these plans were in fruition for a long time. For me, the big thing was when I first joined the agency, actually nobody was talking about lunar exploration in 2014. But then our new director general at the time, Jan Werner, who joined in 2015, he announced in his first couple of weeks the concept of the moon village. And then suddenly everyone was paying attention to this. And for me, it was an affirmation of what I'd been seeing before, that these roadmaps were now being, acted on and progressed. But certainly I think from the outside looking in, it certainly looks like we suddenly just said, oh, let's go back to the moon. But in reality, people have been thinking about this for quite some time.
And so, Hannah, you win the prize, I suspect, of being the youngest one on the call by quite a margin. But in that regard, if I think back to 2010, or I think back to the year 2000, I was kind of aware of all of these things, and my career goes back much further than that. But when for you, before you started your PhD a few years ago, where did that first come into focus, that this was something that was real and it's worth doing? It's not a completely abstract thing. You're wasting your time. Why would anybody do this? Because you've got an experiment which actually is going to end up on the surface of the moon. So tell us how that happened for you and when you became aware that this would be real.
Excuse me. Yeah. So I did my master's in 2014, 15 or 15, 16, something like that. And in that for my project, we did this. We had to design a mission to Mars, which involved utilizing resources on the surface and all of these things. So, but it was all very theoretical, and it was all just kind of arbitrary, thinking far into the future. I didn't actually realize how much that was actually aligned to what the agencies were planning over the next few years. And then when I was looking at PhD projects and I saw this particular project working with this team here at the OU and on this instrument heading to the moon, I suddenly realized, oh, this is actually happening. And then early on in sort of, in that time, so 16, 17, 2016, 2017, going to conferences and seeing, I was talking about lunar resources to support future exploration, and it was quite a small crowd, and you would get the little chuckles of like, yeah, okay, sure. But it's just like exploded in the last few years. I do feel like I've been in the right place at the right time. So yeah, it's definitely just kind of skyrocketed, for lack of a better phrase.
But what do you attribute that to? I mean, this is a general question for everybody here. I mean, even Alex, right? From an outside perspective, what has made space and the realization that we can go and do these things somehow come to the focus again? Because in the end, it's down to money, it's down to resources. We've had kind of the technology in a general sense to do this for a long time. After all, we did it 50 years ago. We're going to do it differently this time. But why the momentum viewed, as it were, think about your parents or your friends or your family, why would they now look and say, well, actually, this is real. We're in the business. We kind of know a little bit, but I always want to externalize this for the audience a bit. Why has it happened? What's been the buzz? So Aidan, go give us the first shot.
Sure. So I like to think of it like as a pretty logical progression. I mean, we went to the moon back in the Apollo times and so forth, and we all know the story around that. But if you look at what's been happening since then, like the buildup of capability around low Earth orbit, the small steps we've been making on understanding, can humans survive for long periods of time in space, and not just survive, but actually do meaningful work. And we've been building upon this incrementally for the last decades on what's essentially a fraction of the budget of Apollo. And now we're got to the point where we're pretty confident in this capability. It doesn't, I hate to say it doesn't surprise people to see people going to the space station quite as frequently now, as much as we bemoan that fact. And now people are starting to say, well, why are we stopped there? Why not go further and further? So I think people are always looking for the next step. I think it's kind of like what Hannah said at the start about exploration as part of what we are. So, why should we stop here? Why not go further? I think this is the question that people are capturing in the zeitgeist at the moment.
Yeah. I guess what's interesting to me, I remember when I was, because I'm that old, I was a postdoc in Arizona in 1989. And somebody, Mark Sykes, who's a planetary scientist, had on his door at the university a picture of, I guess it was of Buzz Aldrin on the surface of the moon, 1969, the classic picture. And written underneath it, he said, this is 1989, so 20 years after the Apollo 11. He said, do you remember now what your dreams were then of today? So, in 1989, people were already bemoaning that we didn't make that step. So I'm still trying to get to that grips of, why now? Because we could have done this in the 80s, or we could wait another 10 years, right? I mean, but what has happened? So Hannah, give us a perspective. What do you think's happened in the last 5 years? As you say, it's kind of changed on that timescale. Is it, I mean, I was going to say, I hate to say it, I don't mean that. Is it SpaceX? Is it commercial flight? Is it missions like Rosetta? Is it a buzz that's come up?
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's this industry involvement. It's given the space agencies, at least from my perspective, from what I understand of it, it's given the space agencies some room to focus on these bolder goals because they can rely on industry to supply the tickets to space and so on. And because of this competition, it just feels like there is a rush. There is a rush for everyone to try and get one step ahead of everybody else, which I think it's been really interesting and exciting to see so many rockets launching again, and everyone desperate to kind of land on the moon or get to Mars. But there is this kind of this concern because for so long it's been dominated by the space agencies and almost like this purity of exploration, and it's trying to maintain that as well without kind of overwhelming the environment out there.
So I wondered if I could jump in there, Hannah, and I guess just as with Mark, a question for the group as well. I'm knocking out of the park with these ultra basic questions, but I guess these are some of the important ones. So the moment you mention anything other than governments, I suppose you're talking about corporations, private interests and so on. The immediate question I have is, so who owns the moon? Who governs the moon? And what are people allowed to do there? I sense it's a simple question with a very complex answer.
Well, yeah, let me pick it up to begin with. Of course, there is the Outer Space Treaty. There is this idea that nobody can go and plant a flag on the moon. You can plant the flag, but you can't take ownership because you put the flag there. You can say we were here, but that doesn't imply any ownership. And that's true of resources as well. But that's become a little bit, fuzzy around the edges now. If we start talking about asteroids, for example, you can go to an asteroid, you can't claim the asteroid. But unilateral laws have been made in the United States and Luxembourg, for example, which allow you to own the resources that you take from that place. So, somebody else might come to your stake and start mining whatever it is you're getting on the asteroid. But if you take it away, it's yours. So and as we're beginning to do those things now, people are really surveying asteroids to use them for resources. We'll be going to the moon and digging bits of it up, not just to put in a museum or to study back on Earth, but actually to use right there and then. We really need to revisit this because it's going to become a question. I mean, even the very trivial one, who owns Apollo 11, right? I mean, what's to stop somebody going there and knocking a corner off it and bringing it back to Earth and selling it for a lot of money? There are laws, but who's going to enforce them? I mean, what does it even mean, right? One of those little known stories, actually, some of you probably on the call know, is that I think it was Apollo 12 that landed near to a previous a robotic mission, Surveyor, and actually did break a piece off it and bring it back to study the long duration effects of that probe having sat on the moon for, I think, 3 or 4 years at that point already. So, of course, it was American hardware snatched by an American. But on the other hand, what if a Russian had landed there and taken it? So see, these are real issues. And, Aidan, I know this is something that's obviously discussed at the EAC and in ESA in general. So give us your perspective on where that's going now, those issues.
Yeah, I think you've covered them quite well, actually, Mark, there. I think that it's becoming a more relevant question to be asking ourselves. And I think a lot of people now are looking at it with a lot more serious perspectives and a lot more legal fine-combing of these treaties and the understanding around them. As you said, like the ownership of resources and what you can do with them and all, it's a huge question. And It's something that I don't have a good answer for it, but I know there's a lot of clever people in the agency and in other groups across the world are looking into now with some real meat.
Yeah. So let me direct to you now, Hannah. Tell us what it is that you want to dig out of the surface of the moon and why.
Oh, yeah. So I'm interested mostly in, so we always talk about water on the moon, but that doesn't have to come from ice in the polar region. So we're pretty confident that there's ice there, and there are a lot of people looking at accessing that water, but getting to the poles, particularly where that water is pretty challenging. So it's in craters that are really cold and really dark, and usually down a steep slope, which is kind of all of the no's for kind of sending a mission anywhere. So I'm interested in producing water in other places on the moon. So water being H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. And conveniently, the moon, or at least the surface rocks, are made up of 40% oxygen. So there's plenty there for us to access. It's just how do we extract it? And there's lots of different ways of doing it. There's quite a simple or relatively simple technique of heating it to 1,000 degrees Celsius and passing hydrogen over it, and that hydrogen will bond with that oxygen and give you that water. So that means you could land somewhere nice and safe in a nice flat region on the side of the moon near to us so that we can communicate and produce water. So it's not particularly efficient, but it does work. And we're hoping to perform that experiment on the moon with the PROSPER instrument, which is in development at the Open University. And it will be a European Space Agency payload launching in around 2025 on the Luna 27 lander.
Now, this isn't entirely theoretical because, of course, you've proven that it works by taking moon rocks from Apollo 11 and actually shown that this has happened. But there's a particular kind of rock that you're interested in as well, right? There's lots of oxygen, but there's places where there's even more.
Yeah, so with this particular reaction, it works quite well with a mineral called ilmenite. And it's quite a dark mineral. So when you look up on the moon and you'll see that they've got kind of the two shades of grey. So you've got the darker and the lighter areas of the moon, and the darker areas tend to have more of this ilmenite that we're interested in. So if possible, it's best if we land there. And I did get to kind of, demonstrate this experiment in the lab with some simulated lunar soils. So it's they are made up of rocks and minerals that we find here on Earth, but we know that they're the same as those that we find on the moon, and we mix them in the right ratios and we crush them up to the right size to get this simulated material. And when that worked, they gave me the go ahead and said, okay, we'll give you a small amount of the Apollo soils, because they're not easy to get hold of. You do have to apply to use them. You can use them and then send them back, but I am burning these samples. Most people do quite gentle analyses on them, so I'm very grateful that the curation facility let me have a go at this and demonstrated that it will work.
But just in case anybody's panicked that we've got rid of all of the Apollo samples, just give us a sense of scale. How much material was brought back from the lunar and Apollo missions, and how much did they give you?
Yeah, so I mean, hundreds of kilos were brought back, and there's plenty still in storage in the curation facility. I actually got to go take a look inside that facility in Houston, which is it's amazing to see where they're kept. But I was talking about milligrams, so literally like tiny amounts that I was able to put through this experiment.
Very good.
It's fascinating stuff, and I have to say that I always welcome everybody from around the world with space rocks, but tonight it seems like that buzz that we've been talking about around the moon is contagious, and we have people asking all kinds of questions. One of them regards the concept of new space, which I think we should probably explain what that means, just like how much of this drive is related to the fact that there are non-governmental initiatives that are appearing as well. I mean, is that where this competitiveness is coming from? I think we touched on that a little bit, but I think it's a really important and interesting point, simply because this has been governmentally driven traditionally, and now it just seems that there are a lot of competitors in the field. I think hopefully in a healthy way, but it does seem like there are some hairy problems down the road. I wondered what the group might think about.
Well, maybe Aidan can talk us through a little bit about, I mean, probably you all can, but point at Aidan, talk us through Artemis and what NASA's planning. And it's not only NASA rocket going there, the SLS with the European service module on the back of the American crew vehicle, but there's also the landers going down to the surface will be commercial. So if you've got that in your mind, talk us a little bit through where the players are and the actors and how that's being run, because it's completely different to the way it was in Apollo.
Yeah, it's a very multinational and multi-entity kind of combination to make this exploration possible. So it's not just a single country doing it like it was back in the time of Apollo. It's definitely a lot of different actors working together. And as Mark said, commercial actors have a part to play in this. So if you look at how NASA are setting up the Artemis for the landers, as you said, there's a number of commercial contracts being issued for studying which lander will be the one potentially to bring people to the surface of the moon. And this is a very different way of approaching this problem. You've got an international gateway station. You have commercial entities coming from this then to the surface, ferrying astronauts back. It's a different paradigm. And then of course you have other companies like SpaceX and everything who are proposing different architectures for getting to the surface of the moon, using their Starship, for example. And it gets really interesting then when you look at, even further afield, like for example, the Starship going to somewhere like Mars. They're talking about an essential need for things like space resources for using the material they find on Mars to refuel the spacecraft to bring it back. So this is a very different way of approaching these kind of missions than have been done in the past. And I think the competition, I wouldn't necessarily always call it competition. I think it's a stimulating new way of looking at things. It's a very different paradigm, and it's forcing people to look back and reevaluate how we do all these things together. Yeah. So I think there's certainly a competitive edge, but there's also a very much inspirational edge to all this.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing we haven't talked about, and I know that you sort of said don't go there, Hannah, but I've got to go there. Well, a little bit, right? Because it's not only the kind of let's call it the traditional space agencies, or the ones that have been active from the 60s onwards, and Europe joining later on, but of course China's a major player in lunar exploration now, with Chang'e 4, Chang'e 5, doing things that nobody's ever done before. Rovers on the far side of the moon, which nobody's done, right? And their recent, and Chang'e 5 actually bringing samples back for the first time. Just a question, because I actually don't know. Is there a sharing part to those samples coming back? Is there an agreement that there'll be distribution of some fraction of those samples for around the world?
At least from what I understand, I think there are discussions going on with regards to how those samples will be shared. So I think it is looking promising that they will be shared amongst certain groups around the world, but who they are, I can't say.
Because I think one of the questions that came up there when we were all talking about it in the media were very interested, is like, well, haven't we done all this before? No, we're going back to a new place. We're going to a location, if I remember the name, is it Rumka Mons? Is that right? Something like that, a relatively recent part of the moon. We tend to think of the moon as a dead old body, but there are volcanoes which erupted in relatively recent time, let's say, a billion or 2 years ago rather than 4.5 billion years ago. So it's all relative. But is that something which is interesting from your resources perspective as well? I mean, people say, well, we've done it, we've been to the moon, but it's like saying, well, I've been to California, so I know what Sweden's like, right? I mean, it is somewhat more diverse than we think on the moon.
Yeah, there's plenty of different regions with different types of material that we can utilize. Even, for example, pyroclastic deposits. So these are these glassy beads. And they might contain some water within them, or even just scientifically though, going to these locations is super interesting because it traps some of the gases from beneath the surface, from the mantle. So there's loads of different places we want to go to. It's not just simply there's a rock, there's another rock, and there's some water. There's a lot of variety for us to go and explore.
So, Alex, you dropped out there for a second, but let me just take one more question with Aidan before we jump back. One of the other things now, what Hannah's interested in is getting water out of the moon, partly we can just use the oxygen to breathe, we can use the water to drink, and we can use the water, we can break it apart again, in essence, although you've had to put the hydrogen in this case. But if you can get the ice, you've got hydrogen and oxygen to make rocket fuel as well. But there's one resource, and it's when Hannah said, gas is trapped. I was thinking from the other direction, actually, rather than the gases from underneath. There's one gas which is exciting in our perhaps relatively distant future, and that's tritium, trapped in the surface of the moon, coming from the sun. And that raises the question, if we want to use that for nuclear fusion here on Earth, that's got value beyond just being on the moon. That's got value for the Earth, and that brings that ownership question up again. So talk us a bit through, some of the thinking that's been going on there. How would we mine? How would we strip mine the moon? Let alone should we strip mine the moon? How would you even go about that? What are the sort of challenges that we need to come up to be able to extract resources on a huge scale from the moon?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I feel like you might have a better answer for this one.
Sure. Well, I think people can rest easy. We're not going to strip mine the moon anytime immediately, so they can relax on that one. I think the challenge for resource collection on the moon is a pretty significant one. A lot of interesting resources are there. For example, you mentioned like tritium and helium-3 and all this so forth. But you have to remember as well.
Sorry, my mistake. Helium-3.
No, it's okay. It's there, but it's also in very small quantities. So the challenge you would face would be to extract it on a meaningful scale, which would essentially necessitate something like strip mining. But it's a question of what resources are valuable to us immediately. So Hannah's been talking about the hydrogen and the oxygen. These are two that we can probably find with some relative degree of abundance and access relatively easy using our technology we have now. Some of the challenges you face there would be things like obviously the environment. It's a harsh vacuum, it's the radiation, it's a very austere solar illumination. And you also have the temperature cycles as well. And then the other thing which worth mentioning is the challenge of dust. So this regular material that we're talking about, it's a very valuable resource, but it's also a very big challenge for exploration there. It's not like dust here on Earth. This stuff will get onto you. It'll get everywhere. It'll get into your seals of your equipment. It'll get into your gears, your machinery, and so forth, and it can really gum it up over time. So we can learn a lot from terrestrial mining here on Earth, how to mitigate against some of these things, but other things we really will have to learn there, and that's the value of doing this work on the moon, because we can learn a lot in that really harsh environment, and then what we learn there is valuable lessons for further into the solar system.
So yeah, sorry, so many thoughts. Yes, helium-3, duh. I've actually worked out how much of the moon you'd have to mine to fuel the Earth. If you take the total amount of material, the total energy consumption of the Earth today, on a daily basis, how many gigawatts do we have, and you then work out how much helium-3 would you need in a fusion reactor, and how much of the lunar regolith would you have to dig down. I can't remember now. It's something like 100 square kilometers down to 20 meters, and it's not going to be very deep because it's embedded by the solar wind. It's not going to be deep under the ground. And that's one nice little strip in the first year, but 100 years later you've sort of mined half the front surface of the moon. It gets pretty ugly pretty quickly.
There's a little caveat I'll add to that, Mark, about the helium-3 mining of the moon. I think it's something people latch onto quite a bit, and I hate to be the party pooper, but one thing I'd say is that most of the fusion research that we do here on Earth is actually focused on a different reaction chain than tritium, and therefore we always joke about fusion being 50 years away. I think fusion with that particular element is even further away. So.
Yeah, it needs a much hotter temperature, exactly. So it's really, really hard. Yeah, DT fusion is the way to go, at least for now. But I wanted to just jump back to this business, because you've been pretty unfair to ilmenite so far, because you've taken out the oxygen, you've just thrown titanium away, right? But you can use the titanium as well, right?
Yeah, so in the reactions that I've been working on, the priority is water. It's a small demonstrator that we're looking at in the near future, but absolutely a lot of the extraction techniques that have been considered utilize a lot of the products. It's not just focusing on one. Most of these reactions extract all of the elements separately. So great if we can produce oxygen, but then you can extract titanium, iron, aluminium, all of these different metals that will ultimately be beneficial when you are building a moon base. You've got the oxygen in the water, you have the regolith to build the roads and the launch pads and the habitats, and then all of these metals So there's a lot there that can be utilized. We're not just throwing away everything else.
Alex.
Oh, fascinating stuff. Okay, well, I guess I've asked a few broad questions, and a couple of hairy ones. But if we're going to be spending all this time back on the moon, so who's going? Who's going to be selected, and how do we make those decisions, and on what basis? Because I'm pretty sure I speak for pretty much everyone watching. I want to go, so tell me why I can't.
Well, since we do have an open astronaut call at the moment, and I'm certainly too old for it by a long way, but there's two people on the call who might be thinking about it. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but
hands up.
But yeah, I mean, so Aidan, you work at the Astronaut Centre, and of course, that in a way, I'm gonna slightly divert the question, but we are now embarking on a program of how we train the astronauts to operate on the moon. So not only do we have to pick the right people, people that are going to be just fine for 6 months on a fairly boring place. Most of us are go mad. We've had a lot of practice in the last year, but how do we train people? So imagine we pick the right people. How do we then go about training them for something that's very different to being on the space station? So the lunar facility is what I'm thinking about now.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, in preparation for these challenges, ESA has not been complacent. We here at the European Astronaut Centre have looked at exploration, and we see the moon is going to be a big target. So we're starting to work towards the realization of a facility which we call Luna. And this facility, essentially, it's like a kind of like a hangar bay, inside which we have about 600 tons of this artificial regolith simulant that Hannah described earlier. And this we will use essentially to test our new technologies, our new operations, and to train the astronauts in this environment. Of course, it's a terrestrial atmosphere, and it's not the moon. It's not zero gravity. It's not microgravity, for example, or lunar gravity. But this will give us confidence in how to carry out operations and test the technologies in an environment that's somewhat representative of what we'll hopefully see in the near future.
But so you've got the simulated lunar regolith. Will people be walking in spacesuits? Will you be, will there be? I haven't looked into the plan, so for me, it's interesting too. Is there gravity offloading? There'll be some ways of simulating it being real, as far as you're not going to, as you say, you're not going to evacuate it and make a vacuum. But we've all seen pictures of the Apollo astronauts, for example, doing tests in spacesuits, whether it's in Hawaii, wandering around on the volcano there, or Meteor Crater. I think they went there as well in Arizona. But so here you're trying to do something that's a bit more fidelity to the moon, probably with lighting as well, which is very harsh and so dark, and everywhere dark apart from the spotlights burning a hole in your eyesight. So so you say it's a hangar bay, but how far are you going to go with the fidelity?
Right. So I was leaving out all the exciting features. I was just focusing on the regolith. Of course, we have a lot of cooler things happening in there. So you mentioned the solar illumination, which is something we're going to try to imitate. Both equatorial, which is quite strong sun on the surface of the moon, but also towards the polar regions where the sun is much lower on the horizon, and it generates these really large, quite strong shadows. We're going to use a very powerful and controlled lighting solution to implement something here, so we can train our astronauts both for equatorial regions and also for polar regions. We're looking into using an offloading crane system to give the astronauts a feeling of lunar gravity, so they can actually ambulate around and feel like the actual response of walking in this type of environment, to give them a bit of forewarning. In much the same way we use swimming pools here on Earth for EVA training, we could use this type of facility, this kind of capability, to train the astronauts for moving around on the surface of the moon. We'll also have a smaller subsection attached to the main hall, where we'll have really fine powder material, fine regolith material, and we can use this to test the technology we need for getting rid or managing dust. So I mentioned the dust problem we had there. This is a very real and challenging issue, and we need to be able to test and see how our equipment and our suits and our technology withstands this environmental challenge. So it's covering quite a diverse thing. As much as we can realize a training scenario on the moon at Luna, we're going to try to do it within the reasons of possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, there's the danger, of course, that you'll end up with something looking like this in the background, and everybody says, "Oh, you're not really going to the moon; it's all just faked." But, This is 1968, of course, which is interesting, right? It's filmed in 67, 68. This is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's remarkable how much they actually got right. And nobody had actually ever been to the moon. It's not quite true because the robots had been there, and there was some idea of what the surface looked like. I picked this picture as well because it's Clavius Base, and of course, if you've seen the film, please don't tell me you haven't seen the film. But anyway, because we've had people on before who say, I've never seen 2001. No, and we push the big red button at that point. We reject out the airlock.
So I actually watched it on Saturday.
There, but you knew this was coming.
I guess so.
Well, I picked it because, of course, the excuse as to why they locked down Clavius and why nobody's allowed to go there. There's an epidemic there, and I thought, well, what better? There is a real pandemic here on Earth. Maybe Clavius is the place we want to go, but.
I have cracked jokes about the TMA1, Tycho-magnetic anomaly 1, and people look at me as if I'm speaking a second language.
Yeah, well, we have some friends who haven't seen the film, and I think we had talked about this before the lockdown. We were going to do a screening for them, and these are people in the space business as well. And you think, really? Sit them in a room, make them watch it, and all just sit around and look at them and see if they get it or not. But how did it work for you, Hannah? Because my kids hated it. They said it was so boring. It was so slow.
So I've actually seen it before. Oh, is my audio okay, by the way?
It's a bit choppy, but it's okay.
Okay, yeah. I'll reconnect in a second. But yeah, so I've seen it before. So I thought I know it's great anyway, but I watched it with someone who hasn't seen it before, and they were like, it is pretty slow. But if you watch it, thinking like it was being released when it was released, and then suddenly you realize just how like impactful it would have been, because it was remarkable, as you say, having not been landed humans on the moon before. So I think it's one of those films that everyone has to watch at least once.
Yeah, my kids have done that. That'll be the last time, yeah. I think. But I forced them. They had to get to the end. They couldn't walk out halfway through.
Well, this is an interesting, segue, obviously one that I'm completely for. Mark knows that I'm equally obsessive when it comes to 2001. Aidan, I'm just going to guess from the models and the paints behind you that you're no stranger to sci-fi either, judging from that display cabinet. But, how much of this is driven by just the fact that, I don't want to say it's taken for granted in a way, but just like when you kind of compare the aspirations of Apollo and so on, it's taken us a little while to kind of go back there. Do you think there's a taken for grantedness about just how difficult a feat it is to go back, particularly now that, without mentioning names, you have people saying, sure, we're going to snap our fingers, we're going to be on Mars, no problem, whatever else. Do you think that the actual engineering and technical feat of getting people there safely is perhaps taken for granted, perhaps partly because sci-fi, but also because, well, we've already been there, we've already walked around. What do you think, Aidan, just as Hannah reconnects?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point of view. I think sci-fi, for all its entertainment and inspirational power, has trivialized the perspective of how difficult space travel is. Even when we fly astronauts to the space station now, it could sometimes be a bit hard to get people enthused by it. Even you have to explain to them the incredible level of engineering that's required to get a rocket to go to space, to get to the ISS, to dock with it, to put a person there to support them for 6 months. And then when you start talking about going to the moon, it's equally difficult, if even more so. I was watching the Expanse there recently, and I won't drop any spoilers, but in the last season, like they escape from the Earth to the moon on a rocket they find in someone's garage, And I was sitting there going like, this is awesome because it's great entertainment. But my God, that's just not easy to do, and they just make it so easy to do. So I definitely think there's a trivialization that's happened with respect to the incredible challenges that are faced with anything we do in space. And I won't bemoan people for not understanding it, but I do think it's important we point out that space is not trivial and it's not easy to do. And every step we take is a hard-won victory.
I'm really interested in this topic because I think there's another element to it as well, which is that not only has science fiction made it seem all that more immersive and more real, that you think, well, this is how it is then. If you remember the film Gravity with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, that she sort of gets into a spacesuit and she's outside in 2 minutes flat, and it's like, no, whoa, where's all the getting rid of the nitrogen bubbles and everything? It's like, well, you're just not going to do that for 3 hours in a film which is only 2 hours long. But it's the narrative is so compelling that you feel, I believe this, right? But I think the other actors which are involved in this, and this is a bit cynical perhaps, is that while in the past it's been civilian space agencies spending taxpayers' money and sort of being responsible about saying what we can do and how we can do it, it's your money, we're doing it for you. The commercial actors, to some extent, have a hype machine which they have to build up. They have to get investors engaged. They have to build. It's kind of a field of dreams approach. You know, if you build it, they will come. Whereas with the civilian, we'd get very roundly criticised for lying about what we thought we could, or lying, being stretching it. So I wonder also if there's that, because the civilian space agencies tend to look a little bit boring these days relative to what some of the actors are promising and to some extent doing, let's be honest. So I wonder how we, in our roles as scientists and educators and people who are actually going to the moon or going to Mars, how can we draw people back into how hard it is without putting them off to the point where we say it's impossible then? So Hannah, I mean, I wonder what you think about that. I mean, you've done a lot of public outreach. How do you see that? Do you see kids coming up to you and saying, well, this is ridiculous, you know, I'm going to go to Mars next week. Why would I even bother?
Yeah, it's kind of hard because you know, as you say, you want to get people excited. You want them to be enthusiastic so that they do they are invested in what we're doing around the world. But I'm really concerned about what happens when we start sending people into space and something goes wrong. We've been incredibly I say lucky, you know, there's a lot of talented engineers behind the scenes that making things work, but it's a huge risk sending people into space, and I think that's taken for granted. And I'm concerned that as soon as something goes wrong, that all of this momentum that has been gained over the last few years is going to take a really big hit. And I don't know what that will do to the public perception of, you know, our endeavour to reach the moon and go further. So I think that really concerns me. And I think there will be a bubble that gets burst at some point, because it's not foolproof. We are humans.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and also it's that difference as well. It's the promise that all of our astronauts, the ones we're selecting now, the ones who are flying, Thomas going on SpaceX in a few weeks' time. You know, we have tested these systems. They've built them. They're tested. There's a lot of work goes hand in hand. But there's some point at which these companies will say, well, actually, I'm not working for you anymore. I'm working for the public. You know, for the public. If they pay a ticket, I'm going to fly them there. Where do we bring the regulation in to make sure, as you say, that if that fails, if 100 people die on a Starship, that doesn't impact all of space, right? We shouldn't ban it. I'm not saying that, but how do we create the right level of encouragement, but also making sure that you don't send completely crazy actors who are going to kill lots of people? I mean, we know that from the airlines. Airlines are private organizations largely these days, but we publicly regulate them to ensure that the whole industry is at a level that you as a passenger can go and sit on one of those planes and know that government stands behind the private sector and says, we've assessed your planes as well. And that's not obvious to me quite how that's happening in the space sector at the moment. So I wonder, Aidan, if you've thought about that particular issue. You know, do we interfere, or do we just let it go? Do we just let it happen? We being government, being the state. I mean, in that sense, not you and me, but.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important to regulate that and make sure that to the best of our ability we can guarantee the safety of the vehicles that we are operating. I mean, it's only fair to the astronauts who we work with to guarantee that what they're going to get into and the vehicle they're going to go to space in is you know, as safe as we can stand over. That would be a fairly significant dereliction, I think, of our responsibility to, if we didn't ensure that only the best solutions were and only the best technology was available to make these things fly. But you're right. I mean, I think perhaps as more and more space activities advance and maybe more commercialization of space happens, there could always be that pressure to, you know, to deregulate, that pressure to reduce or cut costs. I mean, even with the airline industries, you know, a lot of times they fly their fleet to less than savory places for servicing. We don't want that to happen ever with space, because, you know, a Starship blowing up with 100 people on board would be a fairly horrific catastrophe for space travel.
Yeah, well, particularly if they're not, you know, trained as in career astronauts. That people say, well, you know, I went on this plane, I went on this flight because they told me it was safe. I just it was a birthday present from my dad or something, right? At that level. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and it's one of those real issues I struggle with, because you don't want to stifle innovation to the point of saying, well, we'll only do it my way. But governments have a a regulatory oversight for their citizens, not to protect the civilian space agencies and keep this private sector out of what we do, not at all, but we're here. It's just like why we keep the roads safe and everything else, right? And the space business, yeah, there's a little bit of gung-ho edge to it, and it's hard. People die in space. It happens, and it will happen again, as Hannah pointed out. It's not going to happen.
Indeed. Well, I suppose this is one of the key subject areas, that, it just gets more and more complicated, doesn't it? Because, of course, a corporation, will be under investor pressure, right? I mean, as important as public support is, it's another thing entirely if your air supply is a business. Risks getting cut off if you don't have things done by a certain time, and so on, and it's not to question the professionalism of the engineers involved in those organizations, but there's almost certainly a completely different internal dynamic happening in those organizations, just in terms of the management of public perception, how you report on failures as well as successes. And I suppose that's, I guess, in a weird way, it's something we're all going to see manifesting very, very soon. So again, for the benefit of people who are just tuning in, and we have people watching from all over the world, Ukraine, Germany, States, all over. What are the actual timelines we're talking about? Of course, if you've looked these things up, I mean, you'll kind of see, but how soon are we going back? Complex question, I suppose. But how soon is all of this going to start appearing and so on? Because it kind of feels like we're at the cusp of a really exciting moment in our history. Hannah?
From what I understand of it, I think there's a goal of boots on the moon, as they say, within the next few years, at least before the next decade comes around. So I think that's the target. But that's for, I would say, short-term missions. In terms of longer duration, a human-tended base on the moon with an orbiting space station, that is going to take time. I mean, the ISS took 20 years. Well, I guess it's been around for 20 years. But yeah, so I think it's not all just going to happen straight away. But it's certainly, I'd like to think within my lifetime that we'll have a fully fledged moon base of sorts.
Just before we hand over to Aidan on the human side, but you've got robotic hardware going there on shorter timescales than that. So you mentioned Lunar Resource with Roscosmos, scheduled 2025, or so, yeah. But there's other ones. There's Astrobotics. There's other stuff going to the moon with European hardware, with NASA, and China's going there now. So already, it's happening today. It's not all coming. There's stuff happening already. Israel, unfortunately, didn't plant the landing on its first flight there with Bereshit, but got close, and they're going back again. I think they're going to build another Bereshit. So it's not only China. It's not only the big countries. Smaller countries getting involved. Well, or you go to Mars. You make your pick. Go to the moon or Mars. But so Aidan, talk us a little bit through gateway development, and then where we. Because we're, as you say, we're training astronauts now for those things, and it's not so far away that we shouldn't get ready for it.
Right. So you mentioned the gateway, for example, the build-up of the gateway infrastructure around the moon. This is something that's they're cutting metal like at the moment to make this happen. So it's almost imminent, you could say. And then we all heard the last U.S. administration talking about boots on the moon by 2024. Okay, maybe that's a bit ambitious time-wise, but it's not that far off that scale. I totally agree with what Hannah said about having humans back on the surface of the moon in a kind of sporadic exploration type mode by the end of this decade for sure. And then you move on to kind of phase two, which is a more gradual build-up of capability, testing of technologies, and all leading towards this sustained presence on the surface of the moon. And from what I can see, a lot of this stuff has been roadmapped, and what I'm seeing is a nice progression through this roadmap. Nothing is happening that's shocking me. The timetable has shifted a little bit depending on the technological developments and the political inputs, but I'm pretty confident that we will see humans walking around on the surface of the moon by the end of this decade, and a sustained presence on the moon following not far after that.
Well, I mean, this is an utterly breathtaking concept, sustained presence when you actually think about that. I mean, I'm not sure at what point you get to call yourself, would it be a lunarian? I don't know. Right. But at what point? And so again, just going back to we have some really wonderful questions. Hayden watching, he's 11 years old and wants to know about going there to kind of study everything. And So when we go up to the moon, how long do we get to actually stay there? Is it too soon to tell? I mean, again, we talk about 3D printing technologies and other things that are going to allow us to kind of remain there, actually innovate and solve problems, not just ship things there, but solve problems on the surface. What's the lunar residency like? How long do I get to stay once I get my application through?
So depending on when you fly, I guess the answer to that question is if you're going in the immediate time frame, you'll probably be only there for a couple of days for a short sortie, much like what we saw with Apollo. But as we move a little bit forward, we're looking at mission durations of 42 days, for example, because 42 is a very auspicious number in the space world. And then after that, you're looking at longer and longer durations. And it may be get to a point where we have enough capability to sustain ourselves on the surface of the moon that we're doing something like what we do at the moment with the space station, 6-month missions perhaps. So it could be that you have a mission to the gateway, and your astronauts then land on the surface to a pressurized habitat or even a rover and spend some time there for quite a long time before returning back and coming back to Earth. As you start building up these capabilities and the kind of technology that Hannah has been working on, it could become quite a permanent feature. You could be there for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Really depends.
Yeah. I think the one thing to point out, if people are thinking about the Gateway as another space station, current plans for Gateway are not for it to be permanently occupied, for it to be occupied for sort of month-long time scales, missions to the Gateway, using it for resources, but it will be doing science in an automated way outside of those windows. And it's partly to do with radiation. Again, it's this issue that the radiation load above the Earth's magnetic field is several factors higher than it is at the ISS, and on the ISS it's almost a factor of 100 higher than it is on the Earth. So you've got to be concerned about lifetime exposure to radiation, and that is a precursor to missions to Mars, which, very roughly speaking, one mission to Mars might be close to your career lifetime radiation dose, taken the way we look at radiation on the Earth. Now, maybe we can shield against it, maybe we can mitigate, we'll monitor the astronauts. They may, it sounds terrible, they may get cancer, but if we know that it may happen in them, we may be able to attack it soon when they get it, rather than wait till it's already gone too far. But yeah, it's a radiation issue, and that's one of the biggest problems we still have to solve. Same on the surface, right? So I'm wondering what's been thought about. I mean, also, if you're going to dig up the moon, let's go and look for holes in the moon as well, and live under the surface on the moon to mitigate the radiation issue. There are these tunnels which we know exist in certain locations. There's not that many of them, but but let me ask you, Hannah, would you want to go and live there for 6 months?
Yeah. Any day. But I know I'm not going to pass any sort of astronaut selection medicals and things, so I've kind of just decided that I've made my peace with it. But it's definitely, if someone wants to pay for my ticket, then I'll be there. I just think the views would be worth every penny.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned views. Christina, who is in the chat, is actually asking, so why aren't we building a telescope on the moon? Or is that, in the plans? Obviously, that's I think it's a really good question. We've talked about all kinds of reasons for settling the moon, but why haven't we stuck a big reflector telescope on there yet?
Well, as the astronomer, let me pick that up. I mean, Aidan's already pointed out, it's very dusty on the moon, and we build very big telescopes on the ground. A big telescope on the Earth now, we're building telescopes at 39 meters diameter. So that's the game you need to play. Now, on the Earth, of course, we have the atmosphere, and that absorbs many wavelengths which are of interest in the far infrared or in the X-ray. So the moon has no atmosphere, so put it there. Well, yeah, but we're already doing it in space. We've got big telescopes in space which get away from all of the problems of having any gravity, any dust. One thing which is interesting, of course, is to be on the far side of the moon and keep the moon between the objects you're looking at and the Earth, and all of the terrestrial contamination, not light waves, not photons, in the optical, but radio waves. We're incredibly noisy as a species when it comes to the radio, and radio astronomers suffer. They can only look in very narrow bands because of all of the pollution which comes from all of the other things we want to do with radio. And this is only getting worse now with the mega constellations in low Earth orbit, which are going to be spewing Netflix down at us at high speed, but also leaking and covering all of those bands. It's a real concern at the moment. And people don't realize how quickly that's happening. I mean, a SpaceX rocket went up this morning and put 60 Starlink satellites in, and their next launch is on Saturday, right? I mean, that's 120 new satellites in a week. There's already 1,200 of them up there. So yeah, there are reasons you want to go to the moon. And if you want a big array which is connected to do what we call interferometry, maybe the lunar surface is a good place. But frankly, a lot of what we want to do, we want to get as far away from the Earth as possible, and the moon and everything. So the James Webb Space Telescope, for example, being launched later this year, is going 4 times further away even than the moon. And it's a location where we can keep the moon on one side of us, broadly the sun and the Earth, all so we can cool the telescope down looking at the darkness of space. So there are projects which are interesting on the moon for astronomy, but it's not quite as compelling as you'd think, because it's just a mucky place, right? And telescopes want to be clean, and they really want to be clean.
Good answer. Thank you very much for that. And we have a few more questions coming in as well. Some of them touching on things that we've talked about before, but again, doing everything we can to bring people in, because of course, this is what Space Rocks is all about. Is engaging as much as possible. And we talked about laws before, right? So let's just say hypothetically, not putting words in Jan's mouth, who's asked, with this upcoming race with commercial and public agencies, will there be blocking restrictions? I guess, to put it another way, let's just say that, I run a corporation and I don't want to dig on the moon. I'm just going to blast it open to see what's there. What is there stopping me from doing that exactly? And I guess Mark mentioned Starlink, I think a really great example of perhaps, just like a disparity between what people can do and what they maybe should be doing, arguably, and maybe there just aren't exactly the right kinds of regulations in place yet to kind of, I guess, guide where we would like things to go, because it does seem at times perhaps corporate interests can be maybe cavalier, or self-interested or whatever else. So is there a race not just to get to the moon, but also a race to write the right kinds of laws and governance that are going to allow us to make sure that it's open to everybody?
You could tell I just got the police in. They're obviously interested in this topic.
Coming for you. I was wondering. Indeed. I mean, is there a race to kind of write the right kind of regulations and governance that's going to just allow that, just make sure that nothing hasty is done? Hannah?
I can potentially, at least, again, it's all from what I understand of it, bearing in mind I'm no space lawyer. But I think at the moment, a lot of it is what's keeping people doing the right thing is the morals of just not being bad in space. But there's technically nothing, I don't think, substantial stopping people from doing what they like. As mentioned earlier, space policy is definitely this massively growing field, trying to get things on paper and getting people to agree to behave well in space, but I don't think it's moving as quickly as the technology is moving forward, and that's definitely concerns me, and I just hope that we can get that paperwork sort of through as quick as possible, really.
So, Aidan, give us your thoughts on that one.
I was going to share an anecdote, actually. About 2 years ago, I was involved in a workshop with SpaceX talking about their plans to land Starship on Mars. And, their architecture depends upon refueling with resources they find there. And one of the resources they want to get, of course, is the water. And one of the landing sites they were talking about was close to a large glacier. And this glacier was covered with lots and lots of rock. And the question then came up is, how do we get to the water underneath this rock? And, everyone sat around and was talking about this as a room of about 50 engineers, SpaceX people, NASA people, a whole bunch of experts in this kind of area. And they started talking about explosives then, why not we just mine the crap out of it, blow it up and get the stuff out that way? At one point at the end of the conversation, somebody said, is that actually even legal to do that, which I think perfectly illustrates the point that nobody quite knows what's legal in this regards. Is it moral to do that? Is it an acceptable use of our technology to blow the hell out of a giant glacier on Mars to get at the resources inside it? It's a rhetorical question at the moment, I feel.
Yeah, I was just about to comment on that, especially because we generally follow the planetary protection rules, which not everyone knows about, but it's these kind of rules in place where if we think there are places of particular significance, especially in regard to the search for life, so on Mars, there are areas which we believe are potentially more habitable or were in the past, and therefore we don't want to go and contaminate it with our dirty Earth germs, at least not unless certain criteria are met, at least. But that's not, the rule of law with consequences. It's just a behavior and things that we've done in space agencies and so on.
Yeah, and we know, I mentioned it earlier on, the Beresheet mission, of course, got itself in a degree of tangle there because they had various bits of payload on board, which were symbolic payload, like encyclopedias and so on, saying we're putting knowledge on the moon. And it transpired after it crashed on the surface that one of the people had put in, without kind of declaring it until it was too late, had put tardigrades in there. They were in their what's called the tun state, this sort of hibernation state, and the moon is not a place that is going to be habitable by tardigrades. Even though they're incredibly robust, they're not going to come back to life and start running around. But it begs the question, if somebody did that to Mars, then there may be a whole different, literally a kettle of fish, right? I mean, if there is really life on Mars, what are we doing? And I was at another one of those workshops, Aidan, and it was exactly that kind of thing. Where does planetary protection become an issue? And I think sometimes what we're seeing quite a lot of these extreme positions being staked out. It's a little bit like modern politics, actually. Let's say we're going to nuke the core of Mars to get the dynamo going again, to create a magnetosphere, or to get the water out of the surface, and let's nuke Mars, right? Let's just throw all of our nuclear weapons at it. I mean. And I sometimes wonder whether that's staking out a position that's so extreme that we can all agree not to do that, but then we find ourselves halfway, and what we're then going to do is actually unpalatable when you think about it from the original position. As I say, politics seems to be sliding that way at the moment, such extreme positions that we all normalize somewhere halfway there. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a really big question. How do we... Ultimately, it's about enforcement. How do you enforce things? It's all very well having laws, but when you go there and there's no police station there, the one thing we do have, of course, at the moment, is that countries have to certify launches from their territories. And so if a new company starts up today and they want to launch from the United States or from the UK or from Germany, they will have to obey the laws there. But what you're beginning to see now is people talking about launching off sea platforms, off the coast, people talking about going to countries where they're going to bring investment in, and their laws may be laxer. So I already think that there's a kind of gaming of this whole thing going on a little bit. And it is concerning. But at the same time, we don't want to discourage to the point where we just don't do anything. We just sit on our hands, because we're all excited to see what we can learn in space. But what's the cost? What's the cost benefit? And that discussion is not really being had with the public, frankly. It's getting ahead of that, and everybody's sort of being told, hey, it's all shiny, it's great. And only later on do you go, what happened there? My river's polluted now. What on earth? I got nice plastics, but why are my fish dying? Right? We've seen it before, and it can happen in space too.
Indeed. Well, infinitely complex problems. Ones that perhaps we won't be able to completely solve this episode of Space Rocks Uplink, but man, it is exciting. I echo Mark's sentiment. I think everyone here, the thought that we might see these things manifesting in our lifetimes is just, isn't it just, interesting to kind of see where we are going with all of this, and I suppose increasingly, as we discover, history teaches us wherever humans go, we bring our problems with us. So hopefully we can endeavor to solve some of the problems while we're down here before we bring them up there, because as a fellow Expanse viewer, well, we know where that goes if we don't. So we'll just have to see where we go. So we're just about wrapping up there. Just with a few more questions still coming in. Of course, so a final thought. Just with this return to the moon, just with what with this means to us and all this. I mean, it's powerful symbolism. This isn't just, and I say just, there's no such thing as just when it comes to doing things in space, because none of it is easy. But this isn't merely a mission. What about the symbolic importance of us returning to the moon and staying there? Is this the first step in our, our solar residency, and us becoming literally extraterrestrial in a sense? It's a momentous occasion. If we go around the room, I'd be really interested in your thoughts, because of course it's hard not to get a little philosophical when you think about the implications beyond the science and the engineering feats, what it actually means for us to leave our environment in a semi-permanent basis even. It's such a big deal. Hannah, what are your thoughts there?
It's an interesting one because especially as we've been speaking a lot about going to the moon over the last few years, a lot of the people that I work with, they make the conscious point of saying forward to the moon, not back to the moon, because back to the moon implies that we're doing something we've already done. We're not progressing, but actually, as you say, it's not just a flyby and collecting some samples and returning home again. This is our habitat. This is I do think, and I do see it as the first step becoming an interplanetary species. So I think I find it personally incredibly exciting and a huge step for humankind, but that might be because I'm biased. But yeah, I do think it is.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, if we just did a repeat of what was happening before in the past in Apollo, I'd be very disappointed with the way things are going. For me, the statement here is how we do it and the direction we take when we're there. So going there and building up sustainability and making it possible for us to go further and further, this is the critical thing that we need to really be excited about. We're not just going there to put boots in the moon and come back. We're going there to build up the capabilities and the confidence as a society that we can go further and further. And this is what excites the hell out of me. It's something I always try to get across with people who I talk about this, is that it's not the repeat of what was done before. It's something very different, subtle, and it might look similar, but the direction we're going with these exploration missions now really will, as Hannah says, open up the capability to become a multiplanetary civilization, which I think is just incredible to even say that.
Indeed it is.
I'll take, just, it'll be no surprise to the audience, I'll take the slightly more cynical perspective, which is, at the moment at least, some of this is being stimulated by the same sorts of things that were stimulating the first space race. It's not right to call what we're in now a space race in the same superpower versus superpower way, because it's much more multinational, multilateral. Look at the ISS. It's been this demonstration of what the Cold War powers could do when they came together with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Canadians, and we see that in going back to the moon now. So I'm very optimistic and enthusiastic in that regard. But there is still this superpower issue, and China's there, and the United States is there. I mean, the stimulation of going back to the moon and going to Mars is still driven in part by that. I think we shouldn't be naive about that. And then there's a commercial part as well, which is what we've been talking about. Is that exploitation versus exploration? Can these go hand in hand? Maybe they can, but how do you set the framework for that? But I think one of the things we said earlier on, which is sort of fascinating to me, is this idea that we've accelerated. But the more I study all of the things that we do in the European Space Agency, across what Hannah does, what Aidan does, what the friends in science, in space science, all of the areas, and human biology in particular, is actually how hard it still is. How much more we still have to learn before humans go. I mean, Mars is never going to be a place where you're going to feel comfortable. Let's not have the illusion you get your sun lounger out and, I'm on Mars and have a daiquiri. It's never going to be like that. It's going to be ultra frontier living, right? Because it's just not a place that we're built for. So I think we can do these things, but we shouldn't be naive to the point where we think if it's not happening by tomorrow afternoon, then we give up, right? And there's a little bit of that, right? There's, why is it so slow? Why aren't you people just doing it? It's like, well, because it's hard. And all of the stuff that the scientists are doing around the world, actually demonstrating how hard it is, and actually how amazing Apollo was, right? 50 years ago. It's crazy that actually worked. But now we want to do it sustainably. We have a lower risk posture. I think, at some level, the big nations of the West are not so comfortable with risk as we were in the 60s. Maybe China's more comfortable with it. We'll see, right? These are issues too. So I think it's there, but it's still off a little bit in the distance. But if you don't take those steps, you'll never get there, and that's obvious, right? So we've got to take the steps.
Indeed. Interesting steps. And I've got to say, Aidan and Hannah, thank you so much for joining us to help illuminate just what they're going to look like. I suspect we're going to be hearing a lot more about the moon in the coming months and years, and we would love to have you back sometime. So on behalf of everyone at Space Rocks, thank you so much for joining us. And to invoke another sci-fi trope, Mark.
Yeah, well, if you've seen any episodes of Space Rocks, I mean, we can't keep this secret forever. We have a little tradition at the end. It's just, So we space rocks, we have a hand signal, so it's always a test to see who can do the space part, which is the Vulcan salute, and the rocks, space and rocks. It's all for the socials. There you go. Thank you very much, both of you. So thank you too from me, and thank you very much for coming on, Hannah, and good luck in the US where you're headed off very soon. I think soon. How soon?
Depends on everything else that's going on in the world.
Well, all right, yeah, not to put too much on your plate then, and thank you very much, Aidan, for stepping in at the last minute, and we'll bring James on as soon as he's gone himself out of his microgravity suspension suit, whatever he's doing, to get his back healed up. But thank you both very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Very good. Well, Mark, I've got to say, what a stimulating conversation. And, I guess as ever, it's never just about the science or the technology, is it? It's about the people that are going there. And, humans, we take our problems with us, don't we? And I sense, there are very inspiring achievements ahead, if things go to plan, but also complex problems, that we're only going to confront by I guess talking through them. And I think tonight has really highlighted just how many challenges and opportunities there may be.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and anybody that watches regularly will know that I tend to take the not exactly glass half empty position, but the more you look into this and you look at it seriously, the more you realize how hard some of the problems are. That humans are just not really made for these environments. We know how to protect ourselves. We know what the problems are, most of them, and we know how to solve them. But they take time, and they take people like Aidan and Hannah to look in great detail, not just to go on social media and press a few thumbs and say I'm going to Mars, but what does it really take? And I think it is deeply inspiring to me that you've got people of this talent, this engagement, this inspiration, who are actually working on solving deeply difficult, challenging problems. And so I am optimistic in that regard. We've got some really good people working on this stuff. We just had two of them on this evening.
No, we sure do. And we would love to have them back. If you want to stay updated on what we're doing in the world of space rocks and Uplink, sign up to our newsletter. We've been posting it in the chat all night, or just go to spacerocksofficial.com. Mark, as ever, an absolute pleasure to chat with you. And we'll see everyone very, very soon indeed.
Well, we will. And I think maybe this is the moment. Shall we, since we know what we're doing next week for once?
Indeed.
Yeah, I don't think it's been announced formally, but I think, it's up to us to do it. So next week on the 18th of March, Thursday, UK Education Space Office, what's called the ISRU in ESA language, is running a Mars Day. It's a month after the Perseverance rover touchdown on the surface of Mars, and in combination with UK Space Agency, they're putting together a whole day of talks about Mars. So we did Mars a couple of weeks ago with Jorge Vargo and Sandra Siljerstrom, but they've asked us to be part of that day. So exactly how that's going to shape up and what form Uplink will take on that night. It will be an Uplink episode. At the moment, it looks like we're going to have some interesting guests who are old friends of Space Rocks and bring them on. And we'll see how that day shapes up. But that will be next Thursday. We're definitely booked in to do something for you next week.
It's going to be a great chat. Look forward to that. And thanks so much, everyone, for your support. Mark, as ever, great chatting. We'll talk to you very soon indeed. Okay.
See you soon. Bye, everyone.
Right. See ya.